Have you ever wondered why there are health disparities in the Black community? Today, according to HBR.org, African Americans make up 13% of the US population, but only 4% of the US doctors and less than 7% of US medical students. Of active US doctors in 2013, 48.9% were white, 11.5% were Asian, and 4.5% were Hispanics or Latin, and 0.4% were American Indian or Alaskan Native. Research has found that physicians of color are more likely to treat minority patients and practice in underserved communities. It has been argued that sharing a racial or cultural background with one's doctor helps promote communication and trust. Can a relationship between a Black doctor and a Black patient close the health gaps? Does race really exist in medicine and beyond? We are excited to have you here with us today. This conversation is going to be instrumental. I am looking forward to all of you meeting my guests today. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions from our audience. This takes a great deal of effort to pull off, so I'm eternally grateful to my guests and all of you as my listeners. Every week, we create new content and look forward to you subscribing to our YouTube channel and to keep up with us. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing equity and inclusion. The link to purchase the book will be in the comments. For a living, I help organizations implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets through thought-provoking signature talks, workshops, and webinars. As we continue to share the different voices in the DEI space, today we have Dr. Ernest Barthelemy. And if you would like to introduce yourself and tell us one thing that we don't know about you, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. Thank you, Rachel, and thanks for having me. So about myself, I am a Haitian American neurosurgeon. I completed my training in New York City last year, and currently I am completing a year of advanced training in brain and spine trauma at the University of California in San Francisco. And then I will start my new job, if you will, as the founding division chief of neurosurgery at the SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University this summer, with appointments both in the medical school and the School of Public Health, where I'll be able to pursue my global health interests. So I guess that's a good introduction. And then one thing you don't know about me is that I was once upon a time a professional dancer, specializing in Latin and Afro-Cuban dance.
No way. So was I.
Oh,
And
oh.
yes, and you did this from where in the United States?
I did primarily, although my first performance was in Seoul, Korea, of all places. That was in the year 2000. But most of my other engagements were in the US, both performing and then teaching. I taught Afro-Cuban dance traditions at NYU, at the Tisch School for a few years as well.
Oh, that takes the edge off from all the other structured medical, elements of your career, right?
Yes, it sure does. It sure does. It's a great way to manage the stress.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about how it was as a Haitian doctor navigating, race in medical school?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been hearing a lot about the what people are calling the intersectionality of identities, and so this concept that there is race-based identity, and then there are other factors that aren't classically race defined, but that interact. And so I certainly experienced that from the perspective of just being a Black doctor. So I had that experience, but then there was certainly the Haitian experience. And experience is, I think, like an optimistic way to talk about microaggressions, and typically experiences that are either overtly negative or that I found myself having to sort of manage and find a way to not let get in the way of what I was in medical school to do. And one of them that I've spoken about recently was during a course on gastrointestinal pathophysiology, where we were learning about infectious diseases that affect the GI tract. And so we had a distinguished faculty member teaching us all about cholera. And he came to the question of cholera in Haiti and how cholera got to Haiti. And in that session, he explained that in a place that was as poor, impoverished and had challenges with regard to sanitation and things like this, and many other infectious diseases, that it was, you know, tragic but not surprising that cholera would become another endemic disease. And so I was put in this uncomfortable position of having to, reject that, outright, despite a sense that I should be respectful to an authority. But I had to, educate both him and the rest of the class that this was completely false, that that the cholera epidemic was actually brought to Haiti by UN workers. And subsequently, I circulated the New England Journal article where the molecular epidemiology that had been done to identify the source of the strain as not being Latin American, but actually from South Asia, proved definitively that this was not the case. So I don't know whether I experienced that more as an affront or as a victory, but certainly it was an experience that was very particular to being Haitian, in that classroom. And I clearly carry that with me now. This happened, we're talking about, oh gosh, maybe 12, 13 years ago, something like that. No, it was more like 11 years ago. So there was that. In terms of the experience of just being Black, I mean, from being a medical student all the way through my training beyond there is plenty we could talk about. But I think the long and short of it is, it's looking like in like something other than what you are in the minds of the people you interact with, and being addressed as such. And so that it seems like that never goes away.
Right. When you say being addressed as such, is there a
Yeah.
particular experience that you can share with us?
Well, there are several that I've also written about. I mean, one was, I mean, many times I've been mistaken for an X-ray technician, or when I had my white coat on, a respiratory therapist. When I was a resident in neurosurgery. So for people who aren't familiar with the different ranks and roles of people training in medicine, when you're a resident, it means you've completed medical school, you have your degree as a medical doctor, and now you're undergoing training to specialize in some area of medicine. I distinctly recall being patients assuming I was a medical student, if not some other member of the team. Like, it was such a struggle to just see me as the doctor taking care of them, or walking into patients' rooms and having them look for, like, ask me, is the doctor coming? When will the doctor get here? And then one I wrote about recently for a neurosurgery magazine was going to an interview at a prominent neurosurgery program in the greater New York area, and having a senior resident say out loud at a restaurant with a table full of other interviewees, he said, he said, a Black male neurosurgery applicant. I have never seen that before. And that was just complete. I mean, that was just, I was reeling. It was just so completely, embarrassing and enraging. So, those are a few examples of, being seen as something other than what I am.
Right. How did you navigate through it? I know earlier you said that you pushed through it and you had to ignore it, but how does that affect you? Or how did it affect you? And if it does, what is it that you do to navigate all of these intricacies?
Yeah. I mean, it certainly adds, an additional stress, an additional concern. It can carry a psychological or emotional burden that one isn't normally, having to. So like a white, counterpart isn't necessarily having to carry with them, in addition to all of the already existing stress, um, of rigorous medical training. Um, did this impact me? I mean, of course it did. What would it be like were it not present? That's a hard exercise. It's a hard thought exercise. But I can say I clearly recall these things very easily now. Quite, you're very far along. So they obviously stuck with me, and they always go into the calculus of what I imagine one may have in mind when I interact with other people. So it can impact your self-esteem adversely. Um, it can, it's an additional burden. It's an additional burden to carry.
Right.
Uh, how I've managed it, I mean, when I've been healthier in my management of it, and so healthier than just like locking it in and ignoring it and pretending it didn't happen, which is like not the best way to handle that. But I think sometimes that's what we do.
Right.
Um, but when I've managed it in a healthier way, it's finding other people to talk to about it who I feel safe talking to about it, right? So that's usually people that kind of either look like me or can sort of appreciate the experience. That has always been a supportive way. And then just in, I've always taken a very serious, sort of well thought approach to self care. I haven't always been
Mhm.
great about it, but I think my background as both a dancer and then a brief period I was a personal trainer. So I was actually operating in the health and wellness industry. That gave me a lot of useful tools that I called upon to make sure that I was, managing my well-being to the best of my ability and creating the right context for those indignities so I could make sure they weren't getting in the way of what was most important.
Right. In right now, as you mentioned, I think also there are very many stereotypes that others have of us. Do you think the media has a lot to do with how we are portrayed and why those outlandish remarks were made to you in that restaurant?
Yeah. So to the first question, yes, and even to the second one, um, I would say, the episodes like the one that happened in the restaurant are certainly informed by um, very racist portrayals of Black people and other people um, of color and other minorities in the media. Um, I think it's sort of a vicious circle where the media, in addition to informing people, and I think many media outlets do this well, like provide information, but there's also a competitive environment out there um, on the entertainment side. Like they want to make sure people keep coming back to the outlet in question, and so they like to entertain, and I think they try to appeal to how they know people see the world. So I think that's the vicious circle of it. I think there is a racism that many um, so this idea of white privilege, for instance, if people accept that white privilege exists, and not everyone does, but I would say um, it is the um, blissful ignorance of its existence that contributes to this. So, what emboldens a white male to say something like that, in my mind, must be like I usually give people the benefit of the doubt that they are not knowingly racist. I think people who are knowingly racist are in the minority, but I think there are many more people who don't recognize their privilege as being in members of a privileged group, and therefore they are completely ignorant of the burden carried by people like you and me.
Right. And do you find that in the milieu that you are in now, do you have patients that are of a minority or majority group, and how do they react when you walk into the room?
Yeah. So it has consistently been the case throughout my training that patients who are Black, either local African American patients or other, um, certainly other Haitian, but even other Caribbean patients, um, Latino patients, particularly addressing them in Spanish. And I it's another conversation, but I consider Haiti to be part of, Latin America and the Latino experience, and exclusion, thereof is another, racist framework. But certainly have found, even, just to nod to our specific cultural history, even Dominican patients, right, have often recognized a oneness in being treated by me that, is probably foreign to, like, where our families originally come from and where we come from. But in this, all of a sudden, living on the minority side of an experience, a racial experience and an immigrant experience, I have found that I remember specific Dominican patients, seeing me as, brother, cousin, son.
Mm.
I remember an older Dominican woman who, and she was very clear that I was Haitian. I introduced myself as such, as a Haitian physician, and she would call me mijo, and she was just completely comforted to be
Oh,
cared for by someone in this profession who she could recognize and relate to. Yeah, so that's in fact, it's a fulfilling experience. It's one of the things that excites me about this new job
right,
that's waiting for me this summer because of the huge Haitian community I'll get to go back to serve. So
right. Do you think the health disparities occur because there are not enough Black male doctors or Black male, let's say pre-med students that are being admitted to colleges and, further being able to further their their education? Do you think that there's a health gap that occurs when not being treated by Black doctor or a
yeah,
Haitian doctor?
so I think so. A, it's not, the simple answer is yes. However, it's not a simple answer. Um,
Right,
that is a factor. It's a factor. What I would say is it is um, an under-recognized but increasingly recognized potential solution to the
right,
disparities. And I am a very strong proponent of, whatever the language you want to use. Some people call it pipeline programs, some call it pathway programs. Anything we can do to increase representation of underrepresented minorities in medicine and healthcare. Um, this is a very effective way to eliminate health disparities, and we have great literature demonstrating that as a strategy. And I think that's what needs the attention. Whether the disparities come from the absence, I think that's one way to look at it, but I think that's an incomplete perspective, because we know we're living in a post-colonial society where Blacks were not always regarded as human beings.
right,
So, the idea of having Black physicians wasn't even anywhere on the radar or anywhere within the social frame, you know, more recently than just maybe in the past, century. So that wasn't even a real option. So the health disparities are rooted in something that came way before having minority physicians was even an option.
right. And do you find now in your experience that, those health gaps would, that there wouldn't be any health gaps if there were more, Black and brown physicians tending to patients who are Black and brown? like chronic illnesses or
Mhm.
short-term, long-term illnesses? I mean, do you think that would lessen the gap if people were treated by someone that they were more
Yeah,
culturally familiar with? Because there's a
yeah,
cultural familiarity. I know in my experience with my doctor, I know here in South Florida, I had to ask other pediatricians who were friends of mine or family members to find other Haitian doctors, one for representation for my daughter, right?
Mhm.
And I think also, two, there is a familiarity, with different. Our bodies are made different. We heal differently. We think differently. I mean, there's so many other aspects of us. When I say us, you and I, that are similar when it comes to health issues. So I'm wondering, would that make a difference? Because I find if I'm going to two different pediatricians, I'll have I'll have the Haitian pediatrician come in and be more a little bit more familiar. There's a wall, a defense wall that comes down a little bit. There's more interaction, there's a conversation, and there's a more knowing.
Yeah. Okay, so the answer, in my opinion, is it would make, yes, it would make a huge difference. It would significantly, it would bring us very far along the pathway of closing the gap.
Hmm.
So I would call it, so proper, let me just get very clear here, like rigorous. So, um, fully idealized um, representation of minorities in the physician and healthcare workforce is a necessary but insufficient, okay, um, component of the solution to healthcare disparities. So when this problem is solved, when healthcare disparities exist, that produces health equity. That's actually the definition of healthcare disparity. It's the right. It's synonymous with inequity. So how do we get to healthcare equity? Well, imagine we actually did this. We fully represented um, Blacks and Latinos and all other non-white groups in the physician workforce in proportion to our percentage representation in the US population. We're talking about US healthcare, right? And we were equitably distributed so that we're actually serving our communities, okay,
Right.
which is a whole other step. We would still have to deal with the deeply institutionalized racism in medicine, okay, which is
Right.
different from representation. That's a whole other factor. And to your point about our bodies are different, et cetera, this is one of the barriers. So, BMI, all the work and calculations, for developing BMI are based on white people.
Right.
Okay, the norms that we have for most of our standard lab values, okay, are based on research that was done on white people, right? So and then we have this wave of medicine that tries to address, the individual differences in our patients that we fail to explain, even when we're delivering the standard of care. And so there's talk about this idea of precision medicine, where we try to take a deep dive into understanding what is so individually different about every individual patient. And so precision medicine thinks of finding that answer in the genes of people, or the translation of genes, the modification of genes. So we call this genomics, transcriptomics, epigenomics, things like this. And I think that would be a great step in the right direction, because it would help us to move beyond the myth of race and the reality of how distinct every human being is, and potentially learn from, okay, here's this human being in front of me with a very specific ancestry and biological profile, and let's let's really personalize the treatment of this patient to optimize their outcome, given what we now understand about this human being who's not in any way like this other human being, even if they may look the same.
Right.
You know? So yeah, all of that is to say that yes to your question, but there's so much more we need to do. And just getting more Black doctors, et cetera, is just an important step in the right direction, but not enough.
Right. You said it there, there's not enough, but is there research now being done on Black and brown bodies more than before?
Yeah. My sense from looking at the literature and looking at some of the research grants that people are starting to apply for and earn is that slowly this is happening. And I think the George Floyd incident that threw us into this, ongoing global reckoning that we're in,
Right.
has influenced that trend, and it's moving in the right direction. But there's so many, skeletons in the closet, not the least of which is the whole Tuskegee scandal, and other grave indignities that have been done to the Black body, that will slow our pace down and really look at, okay, this is my hope as much as it's my expectation, that when such studies are proposed, that there is some consideration for who's doing the research, what questions are they asking, why, and we really sniff out. I think we're still learning what institutional racism actually looks like, and I don't think it was a factor. In fact, I'm sure it wasn't a factor in evaluating, what is a merit-worthy grant application, until very, very recently. So we're not going to be able to rush into solving this problem, but we're moving in the right direction with it. I am seeing it in science as well, slowly.
Right. Slowly.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that there's such a low number of physicians or black physicians being admitted even in med school. I mean, the percentages are small. I read a study and they indicated that 20,000 white applicants apply to med school and 43% get admitted compared to 10,000, or I think, no, it was 6,500 Black physicians and 10% get admitted. So it's not that we're not there, we're there, but like you said, institutional and structural racism is so embedded into all the systems or the system that it even makes it very difficult for us to find someone like you.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And as all of us, who are from our communities, who are built and really raised by our parents to be achievers and to stop at nothing. We know what we get trained. We to understand when we're in a society like this one. We know we have to work twice as hard. We know, et cetera. We know what it takes. But why? Why do we have to work twice as hard, right? Why does the meritocracy break down when you really start to understand what institutional racism is? Because it sniffs out the historical legacy that we are a long way from rectifying, that has created such major gaps in intergenerational wealth that make all the difference in the experience of someone who just winds up getting born into a middle-class white American family, for instance, versus someone who winds up getting born into a middle-class Black American family. It's you can control for as much as you'd like, but it's just not the same scenario. And so, the pretense, and we're getting better with this. So for instance, like with the step one exam, the step one of the United States medical licensing examination, which for a long time has been a critically important examination for determining whether medical students get to pursue the specialty that most interests them, right? It's not until recently that that became a pass-fail exam. So the tradition up to now has been that's been a scored exam, and the score has been an incredibly important tool for rapidly distinguishing desirable students from less desirable students, right? But we, and when I say we, our system of medical education, I'm sure, was not in the practice of considering what are the social determinants of a USMLE score. Okay, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have a stellar Black student who outperforms, everyone on that exam. Of course you are, but these are outliers. These are the exceptions that prove the rule. The rule is you're going to have a much tougher time finding a large group of Black students who are pulling this off than a large group of white students. Why? Well, you've got to keep going back. How do you get to that score? It takes a lot of preparation. What kind of preparation? Preparation that costs money, that you came to after getting a very expensive education, with other tests on the way that also costs money. Everything from the SAT, all the way up through your medical school experiences. And at every step, there are, vitally important socioeconomic determinants of what your experience is going to be when, you have the opportunity and privilege of being tested and getting into things. So, these are very big cross-cutting challenges we need to overcome if we're really going to level the playing field the way people want to believe that we have, but we haven't yet.
Right. And in your practice now, are there other, Haitian doctors? But I mean, today we were supposed to have, and there's technical difficulties. Dr. Cadet was going to be on with us today, and I know that you do have a connection to him. What's your connection to him? Yeah, I'll let you tell the audience.
Sure. So, a couple of years ago, some colleagues of mine and I created the Society of Haitian Neuroscientists, which we call SHN. So, SHN is currently a 90-member organization that we've built primarily virtually, and it is really a Haitian diaspora organization. Now, we include Haitians in Haiti in that definition, but Haitians and Haitian diaspora organization comprised of people who specialized in every single neuroscience or area of neuroscience you can think of. So neurosurgeons like me, neurologists and psychiatrists like Dr. Cadet, and psychologists and neurorehabilitation specialists. We have even basic science researchers in various aspects of neuroscience. So I came across Dr. Cadet on LinkedIn, and I was thoroughly impressed, blew me away. I thought, oh my goodness, we have a Haitian neuroscientist running an NIH section. I thought this was unbelievable, and I couldn't wait to invite him to SHN, and I did. And he was very happy to jump right in, and he's been a very active member and a great mentor and leader to have amongst us in the society. We'll actually give him a chance to present his research. He does research on the neuropsychiatry of various drugs of addiction, and he'll be presenting some of that research next Saturday.
Oh,
yeah. So I'll have to put something about that on LinkedIn. I've put it out on Twitter and other social media channels.
absolutely. You said something about mentorship, and do you think that's something that's lacking in the medical industry for other, Black upcoming doctors?
Yeah, I do. I do. However, I think many of us are Black physicians, I think we are now making a Herculean effort to fill that gap. You know, and we're doing it out of, you know, a sense of obligation to family, really. You know, there is, and so this is also a recognized need at the institutional level. And I think what you'll find is that given that sense of obligation that I think virtually all of us experience, we will readily support our institutions in institutional efforts. But there's a flip side concern. It's the minority tax concern, right? It's the expectation that minority faculty will engage in, you know, opportunities to diversify student bodies and faculty and make themselves readily available without compensation, and still be held to the same expectations as other counterparts who don't participate in any of these activities. And so, you know, I think the ideal situation is that institutions who invite their minority faculty to participate in mentorship programs and other such things when they're organized at an institutional level, pay. I mean, they pay their faculty for this. They actually compensate them for, you know, hiring them to play another important role that they know is going to compete with their other obligations, their day job, so to speak.
Right. So it's, you know, unless they are invited. So you're saying unless they are invited from the institutions themselves, and it's a paid, when you say paid mentorship program, or what is it that you mean?
Whatever. Well, so let me separate these two things, right?
Okay.
There is the innate desire to mentor. So, for example, I mentor about or maybe just over half a dozen students, medical students, young doctors, who are, I think, essentially all of them are either Black or, you know, minorities of some kind, both local and globally. Okay, and one of them I'm doing inside of an institutional structure that I actually helped create with the AMHE, the Association Médicale Haïtienne à l'Étranger. Okay, you know, and I'm a member of their membership committee, and I've helped them develop that mentorship program. But I'm not expecting any compensation. That's different. That is a diaspora organization. We know why we exist, and we are there doing that effort willingly. But the institutions I'm referring to are the institutions that hire us, okay? You know, like large medical centers who recognize the grave disparity in representation at every level of their ranks, and know that the few minority faculty they do have can be very powerful partners in recruiting more strongly amongst minority ranks. And so it's almost expected that, you know, Black and brown and minority faculty will very willingly step up and work on those institutional efforts with little regard for what that might mean in terms of the actual job for which that faculty was hired to do. So it adds, you know, a new set of institutional responsibilities, and traditionally that new set of responsibilities, whether it's, you know, appearing in publicity, or, you know, speaking engagements, or, you know, or it could be a longer term thing like serving as a mentor. But usually there has been traditionally no regard for the value that faculty member is now adding in this diversity effort, and how they should be compensated if they're doing extra work outside of the reason for which they were hired.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, we talk about mentorship a lot on the podcast, and also sponsorship. How can, you know, I have quite a few family members, you know, that have been able to, you know, to become doctors and, you know, practice in their subspecialties or specialty fields.
Mhm.
My parents left Haiti, I believe, in the 60s, and then they went to Boston where they studied, and then various family members did that. So they left Haiti, they'd go to different parts of the world and study and either go back to Haiti or stay, in the country that they did the university in. And I know a lot of the times it was actually thankful to my grandfather, who at the time realized that my parents were suffering so much racism in Boston at the time. They were both at Northeastern University, that he was able to sponsor them to come for a better life in Montreal. Do you think that's something that institutions think of doing, is sponsoring a potential future medical student? Is that something that's even talked about, or is that even an option?
So I am personally unfamiliar with that brand of sponsorship as an option. That doesn't mean it's not happening. I want to believe that it is. I suspect if it is happening, it's not happening nearly enough, and that is certainly an option that we should entertain and think about what that would look like, a sponsorship opportunity like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And what would you leave us with today, based on our conversation and your experiences, anything to Black male doctors or pre-med students, what would you want to say to them?
Um, so I would leave them with Martin Luther King's wise words that the
Mm.
moral arc of the universe is long and that it bends towards justice. But I would add to that the inspiring title of the last movie that I think helps commemorate, Paul Farmer, who was one of my mentors and heroes. And they called that movie "Bending the Arc." And what an appropriate way to capture the role we can play in bringing about that future of social justice to which we are all committed. And so, yes, time and patience, but it's not, sitting around and waiting for it. We have everything to do with how quickly we get ourselves there. And so, reflecting on that, while we need to be well aware that these injustices do exist and they do impact us, we've also got to be committed to acting outside of the impact they have on us, so that we have our full mental, emotional, physical, psycho-spiritual health, wellness and energy available to us to fight that very important fight to bring about the equity and social justice to which we're committed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. As we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. I want to encourage you to connect with Dr. Barthélémy on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for all the information you shared. It was such a pleasure to have you. I know today you told me you were in Geneva, so it is almost 7 p.m. your time. It was such a pleasure to have you. This podcast highlights lived experiences and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We share profound and courageous dialogues that influence DEI by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, offering best practices to achieve a more significant and cultural mindset. Stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space. Dr. Barthélémy, it was such a pleasure. Thank you again.
Likewise, Rachel, thank you for having me. Thank you for creating this program. Yeah.
Thank you.